Some people hate reading classic books, and I think it's worth taking a look at why. So, here are some one-star reviews of what are widely considered to be some of the greatest books of all time. My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. Okay, here we have a one-star review for the Shakespeare play Romeo and Juliet, and it goes roughly as follows. I was thinking the other day and decided, hey, why don't I write up a review for the world's possibly most effed up play ever? Why not? So I'm going to. As you can probably tell, this will not be eloquently written, and in fact, I don't give a flying purple monkey about the romanticism behind the idiocy that went down that 1 week in Verona. It all happened in 1 week, because this play has bothered me since forever, and it isn't about to change now. On with the review. Over the ages, people have swooned and very literally pined over and wished for a love such as Romeo and Juliet. Schnitzel, most of the books published these days have the same pathetic star-crossed lovers theme to it. It's ridiculous, really, what little sadists we are on the inside. Because somehow, a stupid boy offing himself when he finds the woman he loves dead suddenly is the ideal fairy tale. And then that girl waking up to find him dead only to stab herself to death is instant true love. So, as you can imagine, I disagree with this review in a number of ways just because I happen to really like Romeo and Juliet. But I don't really think that this person not enjoying Romeo and Juliet is because they don't have the capacity to understand it or anything like that. I actually hate that kind of snobbishness when it comes to classic literature. What I think this broadly is a function not of them or of Romeo and Juliet itself, but of how we've come to kind of culturally frame Romeo and Juliet. Sorry, I just knocked my desk, so the camera did a little wobble. So I've actually got a copy of Romeo and Juliet on my shelf, so I don't know if you can hear me as I go. This was an absolute steal. I got these, like a 4-volume complete collection of Shakespeare plays and the sonnets and kind of all the poetry and stuff for £10 total. No, £12 total. At a charity shop. I think that actually referring back to the text is going to be a little bit helpful here. So, Romeo and Juliet has a famous opening monologue. I mean, one thing that's worth noting is that the Romeo and Juliet is in the tragedies portion of this Shakespeare collection. And it opens with, we've got the kind of two households both alike in dignity in fair Verona where we lay our scene, but a bit further down we've got, from forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life, whose misadvantaged, piteous overthrows do with their death bury their parents' strife. The framing of the play isn't romance, it's tragedy. I mean, it's the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet. I mean, later on, where's the line where it says, never was there a tale of more woe than Juliet and her Romeo? I can't find it now. I'm pretty sure it's in the first scene. But anyway, my point is, it's in the play. It might be the ending monologue. So it's not framed as like a dream runaway romance. I think that the points that are often made against Romeo and Juliet, which is that Juliet and Romeo are kind of young idiots and they make a bunch of rash decisions, and ultimately the whole tragedy only emerges because they decide kind of rather naively that after a few days they are in love and need to get married. That sounds very silly if you're reading this through the lens of Romeo and Juliet is meant to be the perfect romance, but it's quite poignant if you read it through the lens of a really quite striking tragedy. All of these silly decisions, they're not evidence of Romeo and Juliet being like morons. They're evidence of them being teenagers, like naive teenagers who have got their first relationship and think that they're in love forever. You know, as teenagers, we might not have brought about such violence as Romeo and Juliet through our own budding relationships, but I would imagine that quite a lot of us have had the same kind of foolishness at the heart of some of their early teenage romantic pairings. And I think that actually adds to the poignancy of the drama when they die at the end, because it doesn't read as simply two lovers dying, it reads as like two kids dying. And that's part of what, for me at least, makes it so heartbreaking. I think it's the naivety and idiocy, if you want to call it that, of the protagonists that makes it such a poignant tragedy. And also, I do think that there is some textual framing to support this, right? Part of the reason that Romeo and Juliet dying mends the rift between their respective families is because they're innocent and childlike. It is heartbreaking to think that a feud between a bunch of, rowdy adults effectively could spill over into these characters that come across as so clearly pure of heart. And I think part of that is the fact that they make all of these rash decisions. So yeah, I think that this isn't in any way the person reviewing this being silly or stupid or anything like that. I actually think that this is more emblematic of a broad attitude that we have towards Romeo and Juliet that I think is sort of missing its deeper elements. And I don't think that's anyone's fault so much as, Romeo and Juliet as romance has become our culturally enmeshed perception of it. And I would just gently encourage people to try and have a look at the play again, more through the lens of Romeo and Juliet as heartbreaking tragedy. And I think that may help get across some of the more heart-wrenching aspects of the play, especially the ending. Yeah, so that's broadly what I would say to that. I think that a lot of people have this reaction to Romeo and Juliet. And yeah, I think it is broadly because we're kind of going about interpreting the play, I think, in a slightly skewed way. But anyway, moving on. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider subscribing, either to the channel, or if you're feeling incredibly generous and want to gain access to exclusive content, including my slow-motion book-by-book bookshelf tour, then consider subscribing to the Patreon, though it's absolutely no pressure. The links are in the description. Next, we have a 1-star review of Albert Camus' The Stranger, and it reads as follows. For Camus, absurdism consists of describing people having perfectly normal and mundane interactions and going, "Isn't this weird, guys? Isn't this so absurd and bizarre and weird, you guys?" The narrative presents Meursault as a victim of an absurd system and a society he doesn't understand and doesn't belong to. Camus himself once summarized the novel as, "In our society, any man who does not weep at his mother's funeral runs the risk of being sentenced to death." No, dude, any man who shoots a prone man 5 times risks being sentenced to death. I think that's my main gripe with the story. I thought I'd misunderstood, but from reading other reviews and analyses, we are indeed supposed to think that Meursault is sentenced to death for not crying at his mother's funeral, for not playing the game, as Camus himself puts it. So this is my favourite type of 1-star review, because actually, I think this person is really close to having a very, very sophisticated interpretation of Albert Camus' The Stranger. First of all, I actually quite like their summary of some of Camus' literary absurdist themes as pointing at normal and mundane interactions and saying, "Isn't this weird, guys?" Because in a lot of ways, that's not too far off what some of Camus' absurdist literature does, right? It points at things that happen that we have accepted as relatively mundane, often social mores and interacting in public in particular ways, and pointing out how strange this is if you don't already buy into all of the presuppositions that underlie that particular way of living. So actually, that first part, although it's, attempting to have a go at Camus, I don't think that it's massively far off the mark of at least some of Camus' literary absurdism. I also think that this person actually touches upon quite an interesting point with Camus' The Stranger, which is that, yes, Meursault shoots a guy to death. When Camus says, "In our society, any man who does not weep at his mother's funeral runs the risk of being sentenced to death," he's not commenting on the fact that Meursault didn't deserve his punishment. Or at least that's not how I see Camus saying things like that. Part of what Camus is commenting on there with regards to his own text is that the weird thing about Meursault's trial is just how little they talk about the actual murder, the actual crime. I think this person is kind of onto the same kind of frustration that the actual novel is onto. One of the disorienting things when you're reading The Stranger is that the murder, the pivotal event of the entire novel, is not given nearly the level of depth and attention that you might expect when it comes to Meursault's later trial and eventual execution. The actual person, the person who has been killed, is completely sidelined in favour of this focus on mores and social graces and that kind of thing. So I think this person is broadly right to say that, yes, any dude who shoots a person 5 times risks being sentenced to death. And the thing about Camus' The Stranger is that that is not the thing that concerns the courts. And that's part of the disconnect between Meursault's actions and the consequences that befall him. When Meursault's being sentenced, if I remember, the point is that they don't focus on the victim and they don't focus on what Meursault has done. They focus on who Meursault is and what he represents. I think the judge basically says, look, Meursault represents such an attitude that would lead to the downfall of society or something like that. Don't quote me on that. But from what I remember, that's kind of roughly the gist of his sentencing. And that's the thing that I think Camus is drawing attention to. Meursault's crime is brushed to the sidelines. That's part of the absurdity inherent in The Stranger. So I think that actually if this person went back and reread The Stranger with that in mind, I think they probably be kind of onto the same thread that Camus is. Part of the point of the novel is that frustrating disconnect, the lack of relevance of the murder to Meursault's eventual fate. So yeah, it is weird. It's an absurdist novel. That's part of the interesting thing about it. The person later on in the review makes the suggestion that they would have enjoyed it more if Meursault was actually innocent. But that, I think, would make the novel a very different sort of beast. It might make it, I don't know, closer to something distinctly Kafka-esque, I guess. In a lot of Kafka's novels, somebody is at least implied to be innocent or caught up in a wider system. Though, as my videos on Kafka have explored, it's a little bit more complicated than that. But I think one of the interesting things about Meursault as a character is that he can be indifferent to the horrors that he inflicts. I think that it's also important to note that Meursault is not necessarily an aspirational figure. He's not necessarily an aspirational figure by the lights of Camus' early philosophy, but he's definitely not an aspirational figure by the lights of Camus' later philosophy, which is far more concerned with ethics and well-being and trying to make some of that work on an absurdist framework. So, in some ways, I'd be really interested, and this is, one of the frustrating things about classic novels often being written by people who are long dead, is that I would love for Camus to read a one-star review like that and see to what extent he ends up agreeing with it, given all of the developments of his later philosophy and the shortcomings that he saw in that earlier philosophy. One of the most underrated works Camus ever wrote was a play called Caligula, which is about a Roman, the Roman Emperor Caligula, the fictionalized version, essentially taking on a very similar attitude that Meursault does in The Stranger and deciding that nothing matters and everything is as good as everything else. And that leads him to not just kill one person, but to unleash waves of governmental horror. And, I'd say this person later on the video says, I don't find Meursault's indifference and apathy brilliant or even interesting, and anyone who thinks this character appears stale because Camus did it first is mistaken. The apathetic protagonist has been done before and much better than this. I quite like Meursault's apathy at this point in Camus' philosophy, but again, I might put this person on to some of Camus' later works, because a lot of Camus' later protagonists, people like Dr. Rieux in The Plague, are anything but apathetic. And actually, I quite like reading Camus' literary works sort of in conversation like this. If you read The Stranger and The Plague side by side, you really get the kind of conversation and tension that is inherent in Camus' philosophy. And I find that very satisfying. So no, this is an interesting review because I think that it's such an example of somebody being almost like frustrated by the bits of the novel that are frustrating. And I genuinely suspect are intended to be frustrating and sort of really not liking that. But anyway, on to the next one. Right, here we have a one-star review from someone who really didn't enjoy Dostoevsky's White Nights, and it reads, I don't understand what people find in this story. I hated every bit of it, from the dialogue to the events. The main character is an incel in a derogatory way. I don't know, it just wasn't for me. It felt like it was supposed to be melancholic and sad, but it was almost comical with the over-the-top sincerity of the characters. Ridiculous, even. And it's worth noting that quite a lot of the other reviews on Dostoevsky's White Nights that didn't enjoy the book also point to this incel nature of the main protagonist. And for those of you who don't know, White Nights is a Dostoevsky kind of novella. It's only about 50 pages, about a kind of man who lives in a sort of literary world almost, kind of sees the world around him through the lens of novels and certain stories and stuff like that. And he meets a young woman named Nastenka. They form a friendship over a few days. Nastenka is waiting for a man that she knew from her past to kind of come back and whisk her away. And after a few nights, it becomes clear to both of them that this man isn't coming. And so they decide that they were going to get together and run away together. And then the man does return, and the Nastenka goes with him and leaves our protagonist and narrator alone, and he goes back to his room. The reason why I don't consider him like an incel or a nice guy, as a quote-unquote nice guy, as some of these reviews have pointed out, is because actually his reaction to being rejected is not one of kind of hatred or envy. It's largely one of like genuine wanting and at least making a good effort to feel very, very happy for Nastenka, who is now with a person that she cares about and loves. I think that, if this was going to be a kind of, I don't know, a sort of nice guy incel-y rant, then you would expect for the narrator to turn around after this rejection and kind of go, "Car, this is just what you would expect from these bloody women." I don't know. But you would expect some kind of bitter reaction. But what you actually see is that he is sticking true to his sort of romantic roots and inhabiting a sort of romantic ideal of the scorned lover. Scorned lover is probably not the right word. He's inhabiting the ideal of a sort of tragic lover, someone who pines after someone else and never gets them, and that becomes ennobled in some way. I mean, there are many ways that you can read White Nights. It's one of the novels where actually we don't have quite as much on Dostoevsky's intent with writing it. We've got loads and loads of letters from when he was writing a lot of his major novels. I'm not aware of as much secondary stuff that we can draw upon to kind of really hammer down Dostoevsky's intention with The White Knight. It's before he went to prison, so it is likely to be a slightly more romantically tinged work. But when you read White Knights in the modern day, it smacks of a kind of gentle satire about it, if that makes sense, because the narrator is viewing the world through this kind of distinctly literary and narrative lens. He sort of assumes implicitly that because he is an eligible young man and this is an eligible young woman, and they are on the kind of stock rails of a romance story, that it will, by necessity, end in happily ever after. And one of the things that happens is that he is disabused of that notion by the whims of fate and this man coming back into Nastenka's life. Again, from a modern perspective, and I'm not sure exactly if this is what Dostoevsky intended, it does read a little bit like a kind of gentle condemnation of this overly romantic way of viewing both romance and just existence more generally, of kind of living purely through this sort of romantic lens. And, Dostoevsky will later take quite a lot of issue with romantic storytelling, and not romantic as in to do with romance, romantic as in kind of the literary movement, which hits Russia slightly later than the rest of Europe. Dostoevsky will later sort of not repudiate it entirely, but certainly critique it quite heavily through his fiction. He will react to it as opposed to embodying it. There are aspects of his earlier work that seem romantic in nature, and this is something that he will critique about himself through his later fictional works, if that makes sense. So you could read it straight and say, yes, this is a tragic figure who is ennobling their own tragedy through their use of narrative, but you could also view it as a kind of satire. It's revealed at the end of the novel that, this person has sort of wasted years, perhaps decades of his life, stuck in his tragic rejected lover status. And even though he's not bitter about it, he doesn't display any hatred of Nastenka. He's not like, I'm going to go get her and all women are horrible or anything like that. He is nonetheless stuck in a narrative role that is making him deeply unhappy and, importantly, cutting himself off from ever having any kind of romantic prospect in the future. So, yeah, I would gently disagree with this idea that that this is some kind of incel pamphlet. I really don't agree. I think that, for one thing, I don't think that the narrator displays any kind of real bitterness after rejection, but also I don't think this can straightforwardly be read as an endorsement of even the narrator's tendency to benignly wallow in their own sadness. The last line of the novel is him kind of giving an outburst where he says something like, I won't remember the quote directly, but something like, "A whole human life for one moment, is it really worth it?" Which isn't the quote. I'm going to look up the quote. I feel like I've completely butchered that. Here we go. "My God, a whole moment of happiness. Is that too little for the whole of a man's life?" And within the text, it's implied that the answer to that is yes. That's the narrator's answer. He thinks that this was enough to justify, narratively speaking and romantically speaking, the whole of his life. But reading it from an outside perspective, that's just his view on things. From a kind of modern audience perspective, I don't know how 19th century readers of this might have taken it, but certainly from a modern perspective, it seems like the intuitive answer is no. And I wouldn't be surprised if that no from the reader is part of the point. And I think that does kind of disrupt this, I would say, slightly more simplistic reading whereby the narrator is just a nice guy or an incel that Dostoevsky is propping up, devoting a whole book to the struggle of him. Yeah, I think the text is probably just a little bit more complicated than that. But anyway, on to the next one. Right, next up we have a very negative review for Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which I think is actually an incredibly readable classic book. I really do think it's quite thrilling. But anyway, this person didn't enjoy it, and this is what they say. The author is an 1800s teenager who wrote a book about a college student who somehow assembles the knowledge and skills to bring something dead to life. The author wastes several chapters describing how the main character has wanted to sleep with his cousin his whole life and loves his family, but doesn't explain in any regard how the monster is brought to life. Rest of the book is a revenge plot from the monster because he lives a miserable existence, and it's Frankenstein's fault because he can't cope with taking accountability for his shitty actions as a college student. This isn't horror or science fiction. It might be a little bit of ethics, if anything. If you didn't have to read this for your English class in high school, don't bother picking it up now. So again, similar to the Romeo and Juliet review, I think that a lot of what this person doesn't like about Frankenstein is a result of going into the book with some potentially quite skewed expectations. Frankenstein is often talked about as one of, if not the first, science fiction story. And in a lot of ways, that description is quite apt. You know, it has the element of the danger of knowledge, and it has reanimating a body with pseudo-futuristic tech. However, in the novel, it's not described how Frankenstein's monster comes to life. The kind of lightning strike thing, I think, is a later edition by, I think, a film. It's definitely a later edition. I think it's by the film. So I can see why someone might be disappointed if they're going in thinking of, I don't know, like Star Trek or Star Wars or any kind of plot where the action revolves at least partially around technology. Like a lot of our modern sci-fi is futuristic. Not all of it, but a lot of it is futuristic. And Frankenstein isn't futuristic. Frankenstein is set in the 1800s, and it just follows a particularly bright student who manages to discover the secret to reanimating the dead. This person actually touches on quite a lot of what I think are the most compelling themes in the novel. So the fact that Frankenstein can't cope with what he's created, and the fact that he doesn't want to take accountability, and the fact that a major part of the novel is this character study of Frankenstein, I think that's kind of, that's what I find most compelling about it. And I think that if you go in with that frame of mind, that this is primarily about the relationship between Frankenstein and his monster, his creation, I think you have a really good time. This person seems to have gone in with the expectation that it's going to focus primarily, or at least majorly, on the tech. You know, they complain that that Shelley doesn't explain in any regard how this monster is brought to life. And I think part of that is because that's not what Mary Shelley is going for. I think that, you know, on a kind of pure art perspective, I think that the book is very, very good at just keeping you in suspense. You never quite know what the monster's going to do when it's enacting its revenge. And the mental state of Frankenstein is so fragile that you never quite know what he's going to do next either. And I think that makes for quite a compelling and tense narrative. But also, Shelley is kind of disinterested in how the monster is brought to life. It's how Frankenstein treats the monster once the monster is alive. And Frankenstein just abandons this creature that he's brought life to. You know, he abandons what is effectively his child. As a result, the monster, having not had the proper responsibility and care that kind of, you know, we think ought to be afforded to a human, especially a human that you yourself have brought into being. I think that's the consequences of that, sort of the most interesting part of that. You know, Frankenstein's monster is only monstrous because of how he's been treated. Frankenstein is far closer, I would say, to a sort of psychological novel than a modern science fiction story. I think that a lot of people are probably robbed of a good experience reading Frankenstein because of a mismatch of expectation. Maybe if this person went back and looked at it as a kind of psychological novel, or like a tale, as they say, that, you know, they touch upon ethics. You could think about this as an ethical exploration of the limits of human knowledge. Can human knowledge go too far? What is the responsible thing that humanity should do with our increasing epistemic prowess and technological prowess? I mean, you know, although the how isn't necessarily the point of the reanimation of Frankenstein's monster, it is nonetheless a thing that happens, you know, and that is an advance in human knowledge that Frankenstein fails to to take responsibility for. That is an eminently applicable theme. I mean, you think about today and the level of new technological advances that we're going through, the extent to which machine learning is being integrated into every facet of our lives. It kind of seeps into everything like a kind of treacle. The question of how to use technological advances responsibly strikes me as an eminently compelling and modern one. I just think that the framing of the book would more profitably be around those themes rather than calling it sci-fi in a way that I suppose is technically true, but I think is communicatively unhelpful for giving people an idea of what to expect when they go into it. I do disagree about the horror element, though. I think that Frankenstein is a very good horror story. As I say, it really does keep you in suspense. But yeah, no, I think this is another example of where we collectively and culturally have, I think, robbed this person of a potentially much more enjoyable and fulfilling experience reading Frankenstein because of the way that we have given him false expectations of it. But anyway, on to the next one. Right, here we have a 1-star review of Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy, and it reads, "I've never read something that uses so many words to say so little. I was over here thinking the Federalist Papers were hard, but this was far worse. Descartes makes my head hurt, in a bad way, and the fact that he was thinking this hard makes me concerned for him. Like, does he need to spiral about everything?" I really appreciate that kind of concern for Descartes' mental health here. If you do read the Meditations, Descartes does have moments where he seems to be in quite a lot of despair. There's that bit at the beginning of the second Meditations where he's kind of applied his skeptical method but hasn't yet attempted to even claw back cogito ergo sum, or I think therefore I am, where he just does say, wow, I'm so disoriented and everything is darkness and what am I going to do? So I in some ways, I think this contains quite a lot of insight into Descartes' tortured mental state that crops up quite a lot early in the Meditations. I do think that this also touched upon something that I think is quite important in Descartes' Meditations, which is that he does use a lot of words to say things, and he is writing in quite a dense way, and he is spiraling about every one of his points. But that's because of what he's trying to achieve, right? So Descartes in the Meditations is trying to get a grasp on certain knowledge. He's trying to discover what it is that we humans cannot doubt. And the foundation stone that he finds for this is that you cannot doubt your own existence. Therefore, that is indubitable. Therefore, I think, therefore I am. That's the reason why he is at each point in the Meditations attempting to lay out his reasoning in like pedantic levels of detail. When he takes 4 or 5 paragraphs to say something that in everyday speech you might say in 2 or 3 sentences, is because he's trying his best to make sure that every single step in his reasoning process is totally unquestionable and airtight. Again, it's one of those examples of 1-star review that I think is actually onto something pretty interesting and deep about the thinker that they're critiquing, essentially. They're going into the book without looking for that sort of thing. You go into Descartes' Meditations, you hear it's got, I think, therefore I am. It's a work of philosophy. It's one of the greatest works of philosophy in history. And then it begins with this, step-by-step guide to doubting all of your beliefs, and then cogito ergo sum, and then the trademark argument for God. This is another example where the story that exists in popular conception of Descartes' Meditations and Descartes' philosophy more generally is ever so slightly out of step with the Meditations as it actually exists. The Meditations as it actually exists is quite a dry, semi-technical work that takes a long time to say everything because Descartes wants to make sure that at every single sentence, there is nothing that you could pick apart to say, I reckon you can doubt this, or I reckon you can doubt that. It's one of the reasons why I think going through Descartes' second meditation, where he builds the cogito argument and seeing, can I doubt some of these premises? Can I pick apart this argument is really helpful because it's difficult, but I think that it's probably doable. Bertrand Russell has a critique of the cogito that's very interesting and kind of treats it as a propositional argument in a way that I don't think that Descartes intended, because I think that Descartes intended this to be an intuition that is grasped all at once, partly because he says that the evil demon can make you doubt even reason, or makes even reason a kind of fallible thing to rely on, at which point you would expect his groundwork for his cogito argument to be intuitional rather than necessarily reasonable in the capital R sense of reason. But this does make Descartes' Meditations, in its kind of attempt to be totally airtight, a very good philosophy text, say for undergraduates, because he lays things out very clearly, but also very densely. It's quite a challenging text to read, but at the same time, it's got immense historical import, and also you can critique it. That's one of the wonderful things about doing historical philosophy, is that you can say Descartes was wrong, and here's why I think that Descartes was wrong. And I really like that about philosophy. You never have to treat a great thinker of the past as if they have access to ultimate truth. And indeed, the consensus among a lot of analytic philosophers is that Descartes' cogito argument isn't a valid argument. And my response to that tends to be something like, yeah, okay, it's not a valid argument, but nonetheless, I think what Descartes is outlining when he says, I think, therefore I am, or claiming that your own existence is indubitable, is something like a Wittgensteinian hinge statement, whereby you are finding something that you can't really justify because you don't hold anything stronger than it to justify it, but at the same time, you can't really coherently doubt it. You rely on it too much, and it's unclear what it would even mean to doubt it. Can you actually doubt the existence of your moment-to-moment consciousnness? And Descartes would say no. And interestingly, if you really wanted to, you could sort of reconstruct Descartes' philosophy on eminently pragmatist lines. I'm sure that somebody's done this. I don't know of anyone, but I'd be surprised if they haven't, because it seems like such an interesting philosophical exercise. But anyway, on to the next one. Okay, here we have a 1-star review of the Tolstoy classic Anna Karenina, and this person really doesn't enjoy it at all, but I wanted to hone in on one particular part, because I think it's really interesting. I wanted to shout at these people, what's wrong with you? Don't you realize you live in Tsarist Russia? Are parties and dances and clothes all you have to think about? Really? That's the worst problem that you have? You're obsessing about dance partners and the supply of good-looking army officers. Haven't you noticed these serfs all around you? Starvation, misery, homelessness, freezing to death. Might that not be a little more important? The reason I wanted to talk about this is because, weirdly enough, I wonder if the later Tolstoy might have agreed with it in some sense. Tolstoy, despite the fact that I really, really love Anna Karenina, and I really love War and Peace as well, although it's been a long time since I've read it. In fact, I might do a kind of reading club on Patreon where we all read War and Peace together, because I think that'll just be really fun. Genuinely, War and Peace is a very compelling book. I think Anna Karenina, maybe to fewer people's tastes, it's a lot slower, and it's about a much more constrained subject matter. It's about, spoiler alert, Anna Karenina having an affair. I mean, I say spoiler alert, that's the most famous thing about this book, so I'm hoping that that's not too big of a spoiler. But anyway, when Tolstoy is reflecting upon his magnificent and well-recognized in his lifetime literary career, in his Confessions, he talks about how empty it all feels. And one of his stated reasons for this is that he becomes basically unable to bear the injustice of aristocratic Russia that he sees around him. And he becomes convinced that a sort of anarchist Christianity is part of the answer to this. He's eventually excommunicated from the Russian Orthodox Church because of these views. I don't know. I wonder if Tolstoy were alive today and he read this, he would think, yeah, that's what I also think. I am also skeptical of these other stories that I made that were all about the suffering of the nobles who, in his later view, were hoarding land and causing immense amounts of suffering. It's worth noting that Tolstoy himself was a noble, and I'm pretty sure, although do fact check me on this, that he gave up his noble title as part of his newfound religious and ethical framework. I have fact-checked this, and no, Tolstoy didn't give up his title, he just gave up his aristocratic lifestyle and chose to live as if he were impoverished, effectively. I am getting him confused here with Peter Kropotkin, the anarchist philosopher who did, in fact, give up his aristocratic title. It's a classic case of confusing Russian anarchists. I don't know, I just thought it was very interesting, because I love it when a thinker's thoughts and a writer's thoughts develop over time, and they end up agreeing with some of the criticisms that someone might throw at their earlier work. That being said, I still think Anna Karenina is very good. I think it's largely just incredibly well written, or at least in translation. I haven't read it in Russian. And the story is just very compelling. The character portraits are brilliant. He's got just, I know that, the kind of cliche saying is that Dostoevsky is the great Russian psychological author. Tolstoy, I think, really does give him a run for his money at points. He's really good, even more so, I think, than Dostoevsky, at capturing what's sweet and lovable about people. And he does this like almost no one else I've ever read. A really good example of this, the character of Oblonsky in Anna Karenina begins the novel by having an affair. He's just been discovered. And like, we all know that that's a bad thing to do, right? You know, we all know that that's not ideal. And Tolstoy doesn't like justify it, but he portrays Oblonsky in such a relentlessly human way. You know that he's done something wrong, and you're not like praising him for that or anything like that. You end up still having this underlying sympathy for him. And Tolstoy is fantastic at doing this for basically all of his characters, even when his characters are doing things that Tolstoy himself disagrees with and would consider wrong. Anna Karenina is a very good example, you know. Most of the story follows her affair. Well, a lot of the story follows her affair, and she is unquestionably in the wrong. And yet, you get to see inside her thought process. You get to see why she's done these things. You get to see what it is that has brought her to this point. And also there's just, you know, Levin as a character in Anna Karenina is just so lovely. I know that is kind of Tolstoy's self-insert, so maybe he's so lovely because Tolstoy has a vested interest in making him so lovely, but he's just such an adorable character. One of the reasons why I quite like returning to Tolstoy's novels is because these characters are so charming and eminently human in a way that doesn't run from their flaws, but also isn't interested in using their flaws to like cudgel them with. He's simply content to record them and record these characters in such fullness that you can't help but like some aspects of them. And I think that's lovely. It's one of my favorite things about Tolstoy. Yeah, but I think that Tolstoy may have ended up agreeing with this critique in the end. Actually, an experiment that I'm doing at the moment is that I'm reading Anna Karenina aloud. You know, I think we so rarely read aloud, and I just thought it would be a fun project. And this is also the kind of pretentious wanky nonsense that you do when you read books for a living. So I'll let you know how that goes. I'll probably write a blog post about it when I'm done. It's going to take forever because, of course, it's a book of about 850 pages, and also reading out loud takes longer than reading in your head. But I'll let you know how it goes. Right, that's all we have time for today. If you want to check out another of these casual style videos, you can watch me ad-lib my way through a philosophical iceberg right here. And thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.